Good evening and welcome to all of you here in the Old Capitol and those joining via live stream to the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council's program featuring our speaker, Ben Novak, on the topic of authoritarianism and Christian nationalism in Viktor Orban's Hungary. My name is Peter Gerlach. I am ICFRC's Executive Director, and I'll be your host for today's program. We are deeply grateful for the long-standing support from our community. Your help has allowed our organization to grow for 41 years, hosting speaker programs with experts joining us in person and online from across the world. As a small nonprofit, we exist because of the generosity of individuals like all of you. Please consider donating by cash or check with the QR code on the table in the hallway or online. We would definitely appreciate that. And I'd also like to give a heartfelt thank you to all of our Democracy Series sponsors and community partners. This has been a big lift for all of us. The Old Capitol Museum, of course, our hosts for today. Texas Roadhouse, did you all enjoy the food?
I did, yes, very much.
Very yummy food, yes. Better Together 2030, the Iowa City Public Library, the Johnson County United Nations Association, the UI Center for Asian and Pacific Studies, the UI Center for Human Rights, the UI Hawk the Vote Student Organization, the UI Political Science Department, the UI Religious Studies Department, the UI International Programs Office, the UI International Studies Program, where I teach, the UI International Writing Program, the UI School of Journalism and Mass Communication, and the Veterans for Peace Iowa City Chapter. Thank you for your support. It's truly been a community effort to put on this Democracy Series. That series, Democracy at a Crossroads, Perspectives and Insights at Home and Around the World, has been an incredibly important and timely 7-part series. Today is the 6th in that lineup. Our final program, Democracy's Future in Iowa, the U.S., and beyond, will be held 2 weeks after the election. That's Wednesday, the 20th of November at 6 p.m. We'll have that in the Iowa City Public Library. For that, a panel of Iowa experts will interpret the elections and their implications for our state and international relations. The moderated conversation will showcase a diverse set of voices representing a range of political and life perspectives, with each panelist offering their views on the new U.S. presidential administration, the socio-political divides in the country, America's role in the world as 2024 nears its close, as well as their hopes for 2025 and beyond. So tonight's discussion really began in March of this year. Some of you were with us when we hosted Frank Langfitt to talk about his observations on democracy around the globe as an NPR journalist. In that celebration of ICFRC's 40th anniversary, we committed ourselves to a many months-long conversation on the topic in the lead up to November 5th, which is now, as we know, only 4 days away. So, to start us off, I would like to share a quote. One, I think, frames well the Hungarian context, what the Hungarian context means for us here in the U.S. Anne Applebaum is a name some of you may know, another expert on Eastern Europe and threats to democracy. She shared the following in a PBS interview a few years ago. Quote, "We have all been convinced for many decades now that American democracy is something inevitable. It's like water coming out of the tap or the air we breathe, that there is nothing special that we have to do in order to perpetuate it. But the lessons from around the world show that democracies do die. People lose faith in them. Political parties with anti-democratic beliefs take over democratic countries. Our democracy, like every democracy, requires work. It requires reform. It requires renewed commitment." With that, I would like to introduce our speaker. Ben Novak earned his doctorate from the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and is a research affiliate at the Central European University Democracy Institute. He was a reporter based in Budapest, Hungary, at the New York Times until 2022. He has reported from Hungary since 2013 and began reporting for the New York Times in 2018. He's also the son of Hungarian immigrants, fluent in the Hungarian language, and I think just the right expert for today's conversation. Ben, we're thrilled to have you here with us.
Thank you for having me.
Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ben Novak. To begin, I thought maybe would you tell us a bit about your upbringing and your background growing up in a Hungarian-American home?
Yeah, my parents emigrated to the United States in 1982. My father was studying theology in Budapest, which was quite interesting. You know, pursuing a calling in religion in a communist country is a bit strange. It's a bit difficult. Long story short, my father left Hungary with my mother and my sister, who was 6 months old at the time. My dad tells this story about, I think they flew to New York first, and when they landed at the airport, it was so strange for him to hear Christmas music playing. So a little bit of nuance there. They actually came to the United States with the assistance of Senator Hatfield, I believe, from Oregon, who intervened at the request of some family members we had in the United States at the time. So my folks moved to Oregon. I was born in Oregon. My dad finished his graduate studies in theology and biblical languages there, and was called to be a minister for a Hungarian Baptist church in Los Angeles. So we moved down to Los Angeles when I was a little kid, and that's where I grew up. So the extent of my Hungarianness is, that was molded by my parents, who spoke to us in Hungarian at home. We learned Hungarian poems on holidays, and we were taught to speak the language, read, and I was not too good at my Hungarian writing. It's something that I got much better at later on. But I grew up in an immigrant family in just a suburb east of Los Angeles. The church, the members of our church, many of them were people who had fled Hungary in 1956, and there was an uprising there. So the Hungarians that I knew and the Hungarian that I spoke was very much influenced by that community. I didn't know how to curse in Hungarian until I became an adult. It was totally alien to me. And but what was a really interesting experience was that the Hungarians that I knew brought with them to the United States the memories of a Hungary that they had to leave. In the case of 1956, because the Soviet army had crushed an uprising in Budapest. So that's what I grew up in. And it was, just like any other family. Yeah. My parents, my father worked multiple jobs to be able to keep up his ministry. My mother worked by his side as the choir master. A regular life, just like anybody else, I imagine.
How extensive was the Hungarian community in Los Angeles at that time? Did you know lots of folks? Were you in lots of spaces where Hungarian was being spoken and sort of the cultural practices being shared amongst Hungarians?
So the cultural practices, it's really strange in diaspora communities. For the Hungarians, I think at the time, I recall there being a number of about 17,000 people who called themselves Hungarian who lived in the Southern California area. How that was organized and how these people kept in touch, the way, from what I knew at the time, was that the churches play a very important role. Ethnic churches play an important role. So there was a Hungarian Catholic church, a Reformed church, I believe a Lutheran church too, and then the Baptist church. And then also there was a synagogue, I believe, a temple in West LA that was frequented by Hungarian Jewish people. And so these religious organizations serve as kind of an organizing function in the community. They would all converge at times. One of the times they would converge was on the Sunday closest to October 23rd. In downtown Los Angeles, there's a park called MacArthur Park, and at the western corner, I believe, of MacArthur Park, there is a monument to the 1956 uprising in Budapest. It's called the Mindszenty Memorial. Mindszenty was a cardinal who ended up living at the U.S. Embassy for 15 years after the revolution. He kind of hid out there. But every October 23rd, these people would come together. And for me as a child, it was always very strange to see because these people were much, much older than my own parents. I mean, they were my grandparents' age. And you would see that very colorful group of people who, you know, in other times probably wouldn't interact all that much with each other, come together to remember a quite tragic event in Hungarian history. And then from there, after these celebrations or the memorial was held, many of the people would go to a place called the Hungarian House of Los Angeles, which was like this Hungarian culture center. And what I remember of that was that it was like a saloon. So, you know, people smoking, drinking, and that's where I saw sometimes, I saw a side of Hungarians as this young American kid that I didn't see at home with my parents, that I didn't see at my church. I had some experiences at a very young age there that lasted with me to this day that kind of, I think probably nudged me to do what I've done in my life so far. Yeah, it was an interesting experience.
As a child, did you ever feel sort of a calling to go to Hungary? Did you take trips there?
We did. My parents were very keen on making sure that we knew our Hungarian roots, but not in a way where it was like you know, wave the flag. But we speak Hungarian at home. Extended family in Hungary. My grandparents on my mother's side lived in Hungary. A bunch of cousins and second cousins. And they really wanted us to always have a relationship with them. So to the extent that it was possible, we would take trips to Hungary when I was a teenager more frequently. Yeah, they wanted us to learn that. What was interesting about that was that there were, I remember, and there are to this day, scouting is a big thing in some circles in Hungary, as in the United States, Boy Scouts. Or what are they called now? It's just Scouts of America or something.
Could be.
But you know, the scouting
changed.
organizations. This is a thing in many countries, and in the diaspora, in the Hungarian diaspora community, scouting was brought over. It was one of those ways that young people could be brought into the kind of the cultural customs of Hungary, learn some folk dancing, learn some folk songs, kind of like Boy Scouts for Hungarian kids. I never did that, so even the people that I later met as an adult or as a teenager who were in the Scouts, I mean, their view of Hungarianness was quite different from what I had experienced. I have great friends who were part of that today, and we kind of look back at our childhood and see where our paths may have crossed at some point. Yeah. Wonderful.
So maybe you can tell us, sort of, if we move into your professional life, will you tell us how you became a journalist based in Budapest, and what kind of stories were you focused on there?
So after I studied there, I went back. I will spare you all a very long story. But around 2012, I was in Hungary at the time, and this was about 2 years into Viktor Orban really starting to dismantle the kind of democratic hardware of Hungary. And what I mean by hardware is the legal structure. And as somebody who was bilingual, who was kind of an amateur political scientist, but you know, an engaged citizen of the world, I was looking at this and I was like, wow, this is absolutely wild. And I was reading the English language press material that was being written about this. And I was like, in some cases you can tell when a journalist isn't a native speaker of the language. Are they writing about this topic the way that they ought to write about it? Says me, who's just Ben Novak on the sidelines. And I was struck by the lack of reporting. People were speaking about Hungary outside of Hungary based on materials that may not have been entirely accurate or did not convey the severity of the situation. And so I met an American guy there, a businessman in Budapest who had been living there for many years, and we were talking about, wow, but there's so much great Hungarian press. They're doing a lot of really great reporting about this, and it would be so cool if we could just make that available in English. And so we had some very generous donors come in and support our work, and what we began doing was just translating media reports from the independent media in Hungary. And that means an article was written, and I would just translate that into English, put in, link in the original Hungarian article, and we started doing this. We expanded, and it became, I mean, it was this kind of avalanche of English language material now that was being put out about Hungary. I'm not a journalist at that point. I didn't even consider myself that. And then as we were doing this, Viktor Orban's takeover of Hungary kind of went well beyond the democratic hardware of the country, and they started buying up news outlets and shutting down news outlets. And so the sources that we had been translating began to dwindle. We found ourselves in a situation where it's like, well, we can't actually do any report, like we can't do this translating if there's not so much material out there.
Right.
And we can't trust other stuff that's out there. We don't have the time to verify this. And then we made a strategic decision that, okay, what if we try to be journalists? So we started doing journalism. We were very fortunate to know Hungarian journalists who had lost their jobs and to bring them on board. We launched a website that was doing actual reporting to the extent that it was possible. We maintained the website that was doing translating of stuff that was appearing in Hungarian media, and we made a very big decision, and thankfully the donors were really on board with this, to where when Fidesz took over, people close to the prime minister took over a very popular and well-respected news website. The staff got up, many of the staff just got up and walked out the door. They were not going to lend themselves to this. And we were able to create a website with many members of that staff who only wrote about the countryside. You know, cosmopolitan versus rural divide is a real thing, and one of the downsides to that is that you lose focus of what's happening outside of, you know, downtown. And what these reporters did to me is I had a very small role in that, but that to me is kind of like the highlight of my time in Hungary. The reporting they were doing about poverty, some very tough subjects. That was incredibly important. So we did all of that. We maintained that until about 2018. Money dried up, and that's when I joined the Times. So I started writing for the Times then. By that point, I had kind of earned my bones as a reporter. I had done some freelance work for other major Western news outlets. But when I got to the Times, I had, by that point, seen so much in Hungary that I had grown so tired of writing the day story. And the day story is, so-and-so said this today, here's what the other talking heads say, and I wanted to do investigations, big investigations. I was very fortunate because at the Times, around 2018, there was a huge interest in Hungary. I mean, by that point, Orban had established himself as this kind of, you know, renegade in Europe. He had made some big statements. He had jumped on some issues like the migration crisis in 2015.
Right.
He'd become this bad boy. And at the Times, there was a huge interest in, like, let's do some big stories then. Let's go investigate things that other people aren't investigating. Let's try to show the extent of, like, what this looks like. So big investigations on media capture, corruption, agriculture policy, how that's abused in the EU, U.S.-Hungary relations, Hungary's fighting with the EU. So some pretty big stories there. Election fraud, yeah. So the hardware and the software was explored quite deeply during that period.
I imagine while these are topics of interest around the world, in the U.S., elsewhere, that the New York Times wants its readers to know, was there any response in this period of your journalism from Orban or folks in his government?
Yeah. So they don't take too kindly to to independent voices there. I've had my encounters with, I guess, the public and more private, efforts to suppress journalism. Mm-hmm. But what I went through is nothing at all what my Hungarian colleagues deal with and have dealt with, and it's quite sad to see that a country in the European Union is doing something like that. A country in NATO, an ally of the United States would do stuff like this. Just recently, the Hungarian Fidesz, Mr. Orban's party, created an agency called the Sovereignty Protection Office, and their job is to anybody want to guess? Protect sovereignty. That's the job. So what they do is they essentially dox critics of the government. They try to make them public and smear them. And they issued a report a few months ago. I was named 15 times in the report, so I wear that as a badge of honor. I'm very, very proud of myself.
Yeah.
But if you guys are all interested, I would encourage you. Perhaps I can send out an email link. They are now going after anti-corruption organizations and Hungarian investigative journalism organizations who are doing some terrific work. These are the kinds of organizations you would want around regardless of your party affiliation, holding the powerful to account and showing where things can be improved. So it just goes to show that that's what that regime wants to silence. Right. That's what they want to stop, to put a stop to.
Mm-hmm. And you're also a research affiliate at the Central European University Democracy Institute. Will you tell us about the work that you've done there?
Well, I haven't done much work there. So I went back in 2023 to Budapest. And for those of you who don't know, after when the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed, and there was this kind of great anticipation of what would happen in Eastern Europe, the democratization, the waves of democracy, kind of going over the region. And one of the things that is often overlooked when people talk about the development of that region is the extent to which somebody like George Soros just channeled a really an astounding amount of money into developing civil society, contributing towards academia, all sorts of things. One of the things Mr. Soros did was he founded a university called Central European University. It was initially based in Prague, I believe, and then sometime in the early 90s, mid-90s perhaps, it moved to Budapest. And Central European University was this really amazing thing because it is a private university in Central and Eastern Europe that had a lot of money to fund a lot of research on things that not a lot of people could have probably done at that time or would have had the freedom to do in that way at that time. And CEU became this kind of, for me at least, an icon in Budapest. I mean, they were bringing speakers from all over the world to come speak there. The student body there was made up not just of Central and Eastern Europeans, but people from all over the world. It was really this kind of beacon of pluralism in the region. I believe it was 2018, Mr. Orban essentially kicked the university out of Hungary. And what happened was the university's board went next door, set up a campus in Vienna. I mean, you had graduate students there who were in the middle of their programs, and so they had to keep these people in school. They set up shop in neighboring Vienna, but they had in Budapest this footprint of this beautiful campus that had just been renovated, an absolutely lovely campus in central Budapest. great library. I mean, it's on par with the best universities. Facilities were excellent. And so they had this asset that stayed behind in Budapest with nothing, no instruction going on there. And one of the things that remained in Budapest, or that they created after they were kicked out, was this kind of think tank research group called the Democracy Institute. And so at the Democracy Institute, scholars from around the world are can apply to do research there. It's not a degree-giving program. I mean, you get researchers coming in, researching stuff like polarization, democratization, de-democratization, important topics, and the building is used by them. They also use the building for a really cool program for Ukrainian students called the Invisible Ukraine, or I'm sorry, the Invisible University program. So Ukrainian students in Europe outside of Ukraine can actually go there and do some studying, help their academic progress kind of move along.
Yeah.
It's a really neat program. And so when I went back, I reached out to them and I said, hey, I'm writing my doctoral thesis. Can you guys give me a desk to work at? And they said, sure. Would you like to be a research affiliate? And I was like, yeah, cool. And so to the extent that it was possible and I could contribute to any events they were doing, moderating events, things like this, I did that. And to speak to the researchers there, for me, the huge asset of being part of that community was and is the access that I have to people on the front line. Central Europe, for many, many hundreds of years, Central Eastern Europe is this kind of geopolitical fault line. To have a presence in a place where wars have been started for so long, where you kind of see the clashes of ideology historically, I mean, that's really meaningful. And to be around scholars who were giving me pointers, criticizing my thesis where it was due, or who could help inform my own research for my work was an incredibly great opportunity and something that I am grateful for to this day. And I would encourage, if there's any students here who would be interested in actually doing research in Central Europe, to find the Democracy Institute, Central European University's Democracy Institute. Great place, nice people.
Yeah, I mean, it's a remarkable institution. And I remember maybe a year or two ago showing a video of a Deutsche Welle video that was sort of showcasing the student protests.
Yeah.
When the Orban government, really started tightening the belt and eventually removed the institution from the country. It's a story that I think not a lot of people know about, or not enough people know about, and what a remarkable place it could have been, and what changes have taken place. Which sort of what you were just talking about, it makes me think about life in Hungary for Hungarians. So you've spent extensive time, much of your life, living in Hungary. Most people in the U.S. have not spent such significant time, or any, for that matter, living in an autocratic state. Will you tell us a little bit what life is like for the average Hungarian under the Orban regime?
Well, it changes over time, right? Just as democracy is not static, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. Even under authoritarian regimes, it's very dynamic. It moves. So in going back to 2010, seeing how Mr. Orban arrived in power, he served as prime minister from 1998 to 2002. From 2002 up until 2010, there was this kind of left liberal socialist kind of coalition in power in Hungary. But what happened in the time in between? So you had a very controversial and quite ineffective prime minister in the mid-2000s. The Hungarian budget was a disaster. And then on top of that, the recession comes in, the Great Recession comes in, and it just wipes out Hungary. I mean, it was really bad. So you have political instability mixed with economic disaster, and it was through that, it was riding that wave that Mr. Orban came to power in 2010. with a commanding parliamentary supermajority. And so in that legal system, what that means is that if you have 2/3 in parliament, you can do whatever you want. It's, you can write a new constitution if you'd like. They didn't campaign on that, but that's exactly what they did. So they adopted a new constitution, and that's where we start to see kind of like, is there an ideological component to it? How is he selling this? They've had this 2/3 supermajority ever since, with minor hiccups when there was like a by-election that they lost, but pretty much for the entire time. Now, what that means for the autocrat, when you can show that everything that happens here happens with this kind of veneer of legality, right? The rules say 2/3, and we have the 2/3, therefore we can do this, and we can pass whatever law we so choose. And they use these laws to take over the judiciary, overhaul and to take over the judiciary, central bank, everything. It effectively became a one-party state. Entire segments of the Hungarian economy had been taken over by Mr. Orban and his allies, his family members. And as this process happens, it's not like blunt force trauma to the head. One day you're this kind of transition democracy, the next day you're under an authoritarian government. I'd liken it to death by 1,000 cuts. And so where we are today in Hungary is very different from where we were 5-10 years ago, very different from where we were in 2010. As a reporter, what I experienced was I saw a lot of the stories from the inside, the good, the bad, and the ugly. But if I could maybe offer a vignette, if I'm out reporting in the countryside and I see somebody on the sidewalk, hey, I'm working on a story about this, I'm Ben Novak, New York Times, show them a card, this and this thing happened, could I get your take on this, please? I'd love to include it in the article. And the Times has a rule that you have to get the name of the person who's speaking to you. And if the person was willing to engage with me, they would say something, be very honest oftentimes. And then when I said, oh, thank you, and could I have your name, please? All of a sudden, people back off. And that's that chilling effect. That doesn't happen to the journalist. That's not even journalism, that's not even the politics, that's Joe Schmo. And you press them on that, and you say, well, and they say, well, my daughter just got a job at the post office, or my son-in-law works at whatever, blah, blah, blah. That in people, there is this fear that one step in the wrong direction, one bad quote, will cost their family financially, cause problems that they don't need in their lives. And this is very much a legacy of communism, too. There was this quote back in the day where you would be speaking at home about topics you ought not speak about, and somebody would say, shh, even the walls have ears. And to see that is still around today, that he's been able to kind of rekindle that's quite terrifying. Again, for a country that's in the European Union, for an ally of the United States, one that we kind of thought would be, a country that shares our values. So there's that. Authoritarianism has to feed itself. You need to keep throwing coal into the engine, and the coal that you throw into the engine is, other people's liberties, other people's money. There's a professor at Princeton, her name is Kimlane Shepley, and she came up with this great line. So every time Orban's people would come up with some new wacky law that would break down democracy in some way, their defense was always that, oh, but that other country has something similar like this. Why are you guys coming after us? And these conversations kept happening so frequently that there was always some other country that had done something like this, therefore Hungary should be allowed to do it. And Kimlane Shepley called it the Frankenstein state. That just the appendages of all kinds of different things, but ultimately it's this creature that's not really a human and not that thing anymore. And so with Hungary, as far as the economy is concerned, just outside of politics, it's so much of it is controlled by the prime minister's office.
Yeah.
It's, he made his family very rich, his friends very rich. If they need something one day to the next, a law is written, that's what happens. Private pension funds were taken away from people, they nationalized them. Try that in the United States. That's, so it creeps into every part of your life and into religion.
Yeah. My wife and I regularly talk about, the notion, the idea of authoritarianism, or, the threats to democracy. And we think, I think the people often think it's going to feel like this big thing just happens, right? But as you describe, it's really not that way. The source that I have up here refers to this as sort of salami tactics, the slices, slowly slicing away at democracy. For those not familiar with Protect Democracy, it's an incredible organization based in Washington, D.C. I would encourage folks to check out their work. Not only do they really talk in depth about threats to democracy, but they also talk about how to have faith in democracy, and how during very divisive times to have conversations with others about why democracy is really important and the ways in which we need to strengthen it. Yes. Can you say a bit, I'm not terribly familiar with this, but the fundamental law adopted in 2021?
So when Hungary had its democratic transition, unlike neighboring countries where the transition was quite volatile, and in the case of Romania, they executed the dictator there, Ceausescu. Hungary had what some scholars would call a kind of negotiated revolution. So the communist elites saw the writing on the wall. By the way, late 80s, Hungary, and already in the late 70s, they called Hungary had goulash communism. It wasn't as bad or as rough as in Poland or Russia or Romania. There were already elements of the free market kind of working there. When the transition happened, there was this consensus reached that a new constitution would not be written. They would take the previous constitution and just make it conform to democratic standards. And there was an agreement on that. Everybody was on board with that. And that constitution, by the way, was the same constitution that was in effect when Hungary joined NATO, when Hungary joined the EU. So it wasn't, like a terribly bad thing. In 2010, when Orban comes to power for the second time, they write a new constitution. They call it the fundamental law. And the fundamental law is this vision of what this new Hungary is all about. So you can look it up online. I think a very good primer for that is that the preamble to the fundamental law is called the National Avowal, and it states kind of what are the guiding, what is it that we like and don't like? Who are we? Oddly enough, it's not. It's a document that has been rewritten, overhauled, I think, more than 14 times since 2012 when it came into effect. It's a nationalist document. It praises, kind of glorifies this very romantic version of Hungary's own history, and it draws on history, Hungary's 1,000-year-old history, quite heavily. It says that Hungary has been inspired by Christianity. There's this close bond with it, and it talks a lot about the values of the nation and what actually constitutes the nation, which is a really interesting topic when you talk about polities that have existed for hundreds of years in a place where borders often change.
Let's talk a little bit about religion. And let me move to the next slide here. I'd like to also share that the Interfaith Alliance of Iowa has this really great document Christian Nationalism, A Threat to Our Democracy, a resource guide. It's really, really excellent. Just sharing a few slides here with you all. I would encourage you to check that out. It is a very, very useful guide. So how would you describe Orban's illiberal, right? We often hear the word liberal democracy, but illiberal democracy in Hungary, the relationship between authoritarianism and Christian nationalism?
Before answering that directly,
Yeah.
maybe rewind a bit. I think there's a really important thing to understand about Viktor Orban and his party to understand what happened after 2010. So Viktor Orban, as a young man, was a liberal activist. In the mid-1980s, George Soros had already established a presence in Hungary. He had a foundation there. They were buying, copy machines for students and paying for scholarships to have students go out to the West, go to the big universities to go do research, to go see a bit of the world. I mean, that's how obvious it was that the system is relaxing in a communist country. And one of the beneficiaries of this, of Mr. Soros was Mr. Orban. In 1989, one of these kinds of really important episodes in the transition was the reburial of a prime minister that was executed by the Soviet puppet government for the uprising in 1956. And that public reburial, the fact that the authorities allowed this to happen in public in front of more than 100,000 people, was a sign that things are now starting to change here. And Viktor Orban spoke at that reburial. This young, shaggy-haired liberal got up there and he gave the communists a tongue lashing, and he said, "You guys betrayed Hungary. You drove us into this Asian dead end that we are stuck in now. You have served the Russian Empire." I mean, he really set himself up as this kind of new liberal leader as Hungary goes into this transition. But there was a problem. When the transition happens, there was already a much larger liberal party. And so Viktor Orban couldn't really compete with that. Fidesz couldn't compete with that. On the right, you had a very kind of fractured amalgamation of right-wing conservative parties, nationalist parties, that were very undisciplined and very difficult to unite. And so from the people who knew him back in the day, you will learn that around 1993, 1994, Viktor Orban decides that he's going to move Fidesz to the center-right. So the guy starts wearing ties, little blazer. He cares about how he appears in public. You start seeing the use of a language that plays on conservative symbolism more. He embraces the religious component of the right in Hungary. And by the time he serves his first stint in government as prime minister in 1998, he's already a center-right Christian conservative politician. After 2002, so he loses an election in 2002, he loses another one in 2006, and he spent that time doing community building, building up this kind of network of groups around the country to whom nationalist symbols were very important, religious symbols were very important. He found a way to incorporate all of these elements into his political movement at a time when the shortcomings of the transition were hurting people. So I mentioned the Great Recession. I mean, you all know what that did to the United States. I mean, it had very similar, if not worse, effects in other countries. In 2010, when Viktor Orban comes back, he says, the transition was good in 1989, 1990, but it wasn't all that good. This is a new transition we're doing here in 2010. And here, the church and the nation matter. And religion and the churches become a tool in his arsenal for the coercion or manipulation of Hungarians. You know, Hungary, Pew Research has done studies on this, very easy to track down. Religion in Hungary, Christianity in Hungary is more cultural than it is an actual kind of practice of faith that one engages in. I mean, there's polling that they've been able to do. So people identify as a Christian. That doesn't mean I go to church. It doesn't mean anything. It's like I like Christianity. And Viktor Orban knows how to play on that very well. After 2010, one of the things they used this new constitution for was to create a new system by which churches have a status in the Hungarian legal order. It's called the church law. They passed it in 2011. It came into force, I think, in 2012. And what that did was it said, we, the government, will decide which churches are recognized as churches. In Europe, and this is not just limited to Hungary, but in Europe, this kind of separation of church and state doesn't look like it. It doesn't have the history it has in the United States. So churches are subsidized in Europe by the state. This was the case in Hungary too. But what happened here was that all of a sudden, the government gets to decide now who are the real churches, who are the ones who get the special perks here, all the subsidies. It's really a nice gig if you get the recognition. Their treatment, as far as transparency is concerned, is entirely different from what your average citizen has to go through. They are eligible to receive, ad hoc amounts of money to just do whatever, build some churches, set up some schools, take over some schools, run some hospitals. All sorts of things, aid organizations, and they are heavily dependent on the state. So this creates a dependency. This is a patron-client situation. Churches who do not get in line pay a price. One such case is the case of the Hungarian Evangelical Fellowship, which is it's a Methodist church in Hungary. Its roots go back to the 1970s. There was a break during communism in the Methodist Church. You had one wing that was like, we are not going to get into bed and take a knee to the communist authorities, and the church split. The radical wing, which said we're not going along with this, was led by a guy named Gábor Iványi, Reverend Gábor Iványi, who was also a man at the time in a communist country, was out there talking about poverty, which doesn't exist in communism. Poverty doesn't exist in communism. So, I mean, the communist authorities went after this guy and persecuted him too. But even before the transition happened, he managed to get his church recognized by the communist authorities. They saw this is a movement they can't deal with. Best to just make peace with him and let him just do his thing. He married Viktor Orban, baptized his kids. But when Orban sought his fealty, Reverend Iványi didn't give it to him. Reverend Iványi's church was not granted. They revoked its status. That's what happens. And what that means is that the schools that this church was running in areas that the state wouldn't even operate in shut down. Homeless shelters shut down because the boss doesn't like them. Mm-hmm. So you see the churches kind of weaponized in this way. Another way the churches are used, a very good example would be the Reformed Church. Viktor Orban is now a part of the Reformed Church, Presbyterian, that a former minister of his left government and became a bishop in the church. And I think was even a member of the synod until recently when it turned out that he had allegedly lobbied the Fidesz president of Hungary to pardon a man who was involved in the cover-up of pedophilia at an orphanage. And this is, again, a kind of showcase of how the churches are used. What's really interesting about it is that you have people who belong to these faith communities, and their families have been part of them for many decades. And this is all happening kind of above their heads. And I think we're now at a point in Hungary where we increasingly see this, where the laity is like, guys, this is out of control. We can't, this is no good anymore. It's scandals like this that come out. So the church plays a very important role in that. There is a certain moral authority that churches command in certain situations. And in Hungary, this is something that the government has very eagerly exploited.
And amongst the people in Hungary, Christianity is a big part of life in Hungary, or what is that blend of the autocratic state and the presence or the valuing of the living out of a kind of Christianity that serves the government, but also serves the people? It must.
So there's certainly a totally, I think, innocent and nice identity building function of Christianity. So the founding of the Kingdom of Hungary around the year 1000 begins when the king, who was then a chieftain above a confederation of tribes, he becomes a Christian. Rome acknowledges this Christian kingdom, and that is considered the founding of the Kingdom of Hungary. So even in the genesis of this polity that emerges, it was this belonging to Rome. They chose Rome, not the Byzantium. This is when they stepped into what was then the kind of civilizational development of Western Europe. They became a member of the club. Not just Hungary. I mean, this is this was the same story for all of these polities, many of these polities that were in Eastern Europe, and it's a story of we're a Christian nation. Mm-hmm. King Stephen became a saint. That is very important. In Europe, the churches, mostly the Catholic Church, played an incredibly important role in the development, the political and economic development and social development of the continent. So the church was a major landholder all over Europe. The church always played an important role. What you see now in Hungary's case is that the state has asserted itself over the churches in a way that really harkens back to the communist times. On paper, churches were allowed to exist in communist countries, but the extent to which they existed and what they were able to do was something that was very tightly controlled. The methods of coercion have changed over time. For Viktor Orban, it was the new way to coerce is financial, really. Yeah.
In the interest of time, we were going to talk a little bit about propaganda as well, and perhaps there are folks in the audience that have sort of questions on disinformation and how that serves. I think I want to move towards maybe to what a lot of folks are thinking, at least, and here with these slides. Happy to share these also with folks afterwards. We can put it on the ICFRC website. Some great resources here, and the idea of propaganda as a kind of fire hose of falsehood, in Hungary. A lot to say here, to be sure, and I think some of it you have already by the ways in which the government, really sort of oversees everything and has such great control over everything, and would be hard to do. Some of Ben's photos here would be hard to do without, a pretty impressive propaganda, mechanism. I want to move us then to how the Hungarian example might might signal things that are happening here in the U.S. So many people in this country view the political right's affinity for Viktor Orban as quite troubling. So how do you view the deepening ties between these two? So there have been many meetings between the two sides. There's been the creation of Project 2025, which some link to a lot of what's happening in Orban's government has influenced there. There have been concerns raised by former Trump aides, now fearful of his return to the White House. Do you think, as this sort of posits here, that the Orbanization of America, as an October 2024 European Council on Foreign Relations Policy brief put it, do you think that's underway?
Zuzana, if you're watching, I know one of the people who authored this. I say this with all due respect. I kind of disagree with this. I'd like to flesh it out a bit. Viktor Orban's been in power for a very, very long time. He's the undisputed ruler of a country of about 9 million people whose GDP is about a quarter of the U.S. defense budget, annual defense budget. So when we talk about the influence, and is there a vision? Does he have it right? Let's put it in context as to what we're looking at when we talk about it. The Hungarian economy is a mess. The state is crumbling under its own weight. We are now, just this year, had a very prominent elite defection. We've got these, when you have so much power as these guys have and you have no real opposition, all that happens is unforced errors. You generate your own scandals, and you keep shooting yourself in the foot. And that's kind of where Orban is right now. And I mentioned earlier his kind of development ideologically, how he's changed over the years. We are seeing this happen right now as well. So there are a lot of reasons why I would argue that while, yes, there are certainly tendencies, very unfortunate political tendencies that are present in Hungary that could be carried over to the United States, and we've seen examples of these. Why I would argue that structurally, the way American society is built up, it's a really hard sell to make that happen here. Certain social characteristics of the United States, the amount of decentralization, so many different states within this massive country. It's been a tough time for the middle class for the past few years, but there is a very strong and independent middle class in the United States. Whether you like it or not, people here own guns. There are a lot of things that make the United States a really different place. I do not see President Trump, based on his previous administration, as somebody who is ideological in the way that Orban is. So Orban, if his career is a testament to anything, it is that he is a political survivor. He lives from one day to the next. He's like a shapeshifter. A man who made his political fortunes on being the anti-Russian imperialist is today the man who stands with Russia as it wages this war next door. So Orban changes. Mm-hmm. I think what Orban sees in Donald Trump is not so much an ally, much more that what a potential Trump administration would mean for Europe and Orban's own ability to remain in power. Mm-hmm. That said, there are some pretty alarming things that one hears and reads in the paper about what is coming out, what is emerging from certain circles that have some sort of affiliation to President Trump and former President Trump in the campaign. It's a tough. I don't know what to say. I would just say, keep being Americans. Like this is a very good thing we have going here. It's a tough read. My sense is that, given the chaos of the first administration, there's been a really hardcore effort here to infuse a potential Trump administration with like a serious ideological component. Mm-hmm. I mean, perhaps in backlash to some of the social movements that we've had in the United States in recent years, and this increasing narrative from some cultural conservatives and people on the right about, the United States succumbing to this kind of cultural and civilizational despair, that lends itself well to the argument that we need a tough leader who comes in here and straightens everything out. I'm not sure that it would look anything like Hungary if it could happen.
And I have to say, when you and I spoke before, that's part of what I really appreciated about our conversation is that you have the perspective of being in Hungary, of seeing what it's like to live in the country. You even noted that being an American journalist working for the New York Times, that there is a spotlight on you, so you understand in ways that I think many of us can't hear because we haven't lived in such a country where all these things are happening and where one person does have so much power. And you're certainly right that the two countries are very different from one another.
And here's where I'll argue with you on that. I think you don't have to live in another country to see that. You have to look at this country's own history. There are people in this room who have lived through some really dark chapters of this country. Things that happened here, for better or for worse, have taught society about the importance of certain values and the importance of sticking up for certain values. And I think that's the beauty of America, and it's, in my view, one of the awesome things about democracy is that it's constantly evolving. It has to constantly adapt. You never get it right all the time. But when you see that it's not right, you can make those little adjustments. And those adjustments, they don't start in Washington. They start here. They start at your neighborhood. They start at your kid's school. And you can do that here. And people are totally comfortable doing that here. And I think that's a very positive sign. The tragic thing about a place like Hungary over the years is that you saw the protests year after year after year. Newspapers being bought up just so they would be shut down. Universities being kicked out of the countries. People being, civil society people being arrested, harassed. I mean, I could give you the list. Every year the protests got smaller and smaller and smaller. People just stopped going out. That's when I would start getting worried. But I don't see that happening here in the United States. I mean, the protests happened just outside the demonstrations just outside the door here. These are positive signs. So, yeah.
I think that's a good place to leave it. So Q&A, if you have a question for Ben, we have the note cards. Feel free to raise it above, and we'll introduce your ideas and your questions into the conversation. I love that as sort of advice, for people, because this is a heavy conversation, and I think a lot of us have, we have uncertainties. We don't know what's going to happen next. The two candidates for president are very different from one another, and so it is good to hear in a topic where I know several folks have said to me, I'm really glad that ICFRC is talking about authoritarianism and Christian nationalism in Hungary, because I think for some it does feel familiar. So it's important. It is really important. It goes back to, why we have these conversations, why we have to have the facts, why we have to really think critically about how the contexts are very different, and how that is Hungary and this is the United States. There may be parallels. There's no denying that these two gentlemen have affinity for one another, but it doesn't necessarily. It may not necessarily mean more than that.
And in the age of kind of strongman politics, oftentimes it is that relationship that can be a deciding factor. I mean, this is a great opportunity to kind of bring up the difference between what an institution means, what agreements mean, what treaties mean. There are some people who believe that it's the leader, he's going to work it out, whatever. I would prefer that if anybody engages with the United States, it doesn't matter which administration you're engaging with. The presidency is the highest elected office. You deal with them, and I would hope that the United States citizens, vote very, very wisely when they do vote. But I would want to make one quick point here. I don't think Viktor Orban is a conservative. In my years of reporting, I have come to see that regime as incredibly cynical and corrupt. And when I express a very critical view that is informed by my own work, I'm not just pulling this out of a hat, this is not at all a criticism of people who are conservative. This is not where that comes from. I don't see Viktor Orban as that. I see him as somebody who is now tapped into like a zeitgeist and is very efficiently exploiting that to his own gain.
Okay. Thank you. Could you talk about the positions and values of the two-thirds? What holds them loyal to Orbanism?
Money. One of the things you see that I noticed in Hungary is that you don't get to very important positions without being blackmailable some way. Somebody's got to have something on you. You need to, the whip must be able to steer you in the direction you need to go. The two-thirds are the way they sell themselves, the way Fidesz sells itself is that Fidesz embodies the representation of the nation. They are the sole representatives of the nation. So their will, when they do something, make some decision, that is a decision made in the interest of the nation. Viktor Orban, as the head of this thing, is the man who delivers for the people. And following him, this unquestionable support for the boss, which is his nickname, by the way.
Yeah,
they call him
people
the boss.
Call him the boss.
His name is the boss. They will protect you when you get in trouble. You'll be taken care of to the extent that something can be swept under the rug. But the second you step out of line, they will destroy you. I would encourage you all to read an article from 2019 in the New York Times, a very big piece we did. It's called "The Money Farmers." It's a long read, but in that particular story, there is a case that highlights what happens when somebody steps out of line and doesn't do what the boss says. And that's what keeps them together. That and also the fact that there is so much invested in keeping that man where he is. When you steal as much as they steal, you need to keep that system afloat, lest there be a day of reckoning. And there's also that aspect to it as well.
This question is certainly a different direction. Is Christian nationalism similar to Jewish nationalism in Israel? I don't know if that's one you can...
I mean, there would be an overlap, I imagine. Yoram Hazony, didn't he write a book called The Virtues of Nationalism? And he's one of these thinkers who is kind of pushing this. It's very hard. I don't know what Christian nationalism is. There is this idea that somehow the state must be infused with the principles of Christianity that will then guide and organize society and keep everything in order. But I don't know that we actually have a case of anywhere this happening nowadays that we could point at and say, okay, they're doing a Christian nationalism. And what that looks at, oftentimes, at least from what I've read, about the so-called ideologues there. It's a lot of grievance politics. I don't know whether there is like a coherent ideology there beyond the fact we have to have a Christian country, and I guess it should be Christian values. I don't know what that means. Jewish nationalism was the other question. Let's get.
Is it similar to Jewish nationalism in Israel?
That's prickly.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe we can talk about that afterwards. I would have to think about that.
Sure.
I don't know that I'm qualified to speak on that.
Yeah, perfectly fair. Another question, given that Trump is years behind Orban, do you see the early signs in Trump?
Early signs of Orban in Trump?
Maybe, if I'm reading into the question, that if Trump wants to be like Orban, if he wants to have such a situation, such a control over the country, do you see some early signs of that happening?
So in the Trump administration, the ambassador that President Trump appointed to Hungary was a gentleman by the name of David Kornstein. And David Kornstein is a retired jewelry merchant from New York City, one of Trump's pals, and a member at Mar-a-Lago. Kornstein is a very close friend of Donald Trump, and did a lot to build this relationship between Orban and Trump. He once said that he was talking about the courts in Hungary. He said that Donald Trump would love to have what Viktor Orban has. So, but does that necessarily mean that Donald Trump is a scheming, strategist of sorts? He's a businessman, just wants to get things done quick. I don't know. But that he would even say this, that the U.S. ambassador would even say this, knowing what that does in Hungary, was quite alarming. So maybe. Maybe at least, and it seems that in the case of the courts, certainly got a lot of appointments during his administration.
Relations between Orban and Transylvanian Hungarians, his trip to Tbilisi this week.
Yeah,
that's all I have to work with. I don't know if there's a question in there. Yeah. So
Transylvanian Hungarians. So if you look at a map of Central Europe, you'll see this mountain range, the Carpathians. They make kind of a circle around the Carpathian Basin. Historically, with like shifts in the borders, but pretty much that area was considered Hungary. Hungary, after the Mongol invasions in the 13th century, and especially after the Ottoman occupation in the 16th century, develops as this multi-ethnic territory. So ethnic Germans were transplanted there. You got your Romanians, you've got the Slavs in the south, you got the Slavs in the north. But it was just like pockets of different ethnic national groups, we would call them national groups now, all around that area. And in Transylvania, which is Western Romania, was historically a part of this historical Hungary. And the Transylvanian Hungarians are very important to Mr. Orban. He gave them the right to vote after 2010, and it is like North Korea results. It's like 99%, it's like 96 something percent vote for Orban and help keep that two-thirds very strong. But by going to Romania, to Transylvania very frequently, it helps kind of play on this politics of grievance. How is it that we could be separated from our country folk with this border, which, if anybody's aware of what's happened in Ukraine recently, can certainly understand why that's a very dangerous topic to be playing with.
Last question. Some fragile democracies, like India and Lebanon, are rife with castes and tribalism. How well does it work to use affirmative action for government positions? Examples, I believe it says 45% of more legislatures must be untouchables. Untouchables in India. The Lebanese prime minister must be a Christian. 20% of Afghan legislators must be female. Examples like that.
I'm not an expert on India. I'm not an expert on Lebanon. Not even an expert on affirmative action. But I do know that some political scientists have done research into constitutional design in places that were democratizing or that had decided to go the course of democracy. And when you have polities or states where there's many different ethnic groups, one of the ways to increase legitimacy of the political system, to help everybody feel as though they have ownership in the system, is to work out some kind of compromise of power sharing within the same structure, where everybody's a part of the same of it. I don't know that there's a perfect answer for it. You know, we should all try to to extend opportunities to everybody.
Okay, I do have one last question before I close. It's a bit more personal.
Please.
When you're visiting Hungary today, do you feel safe? For example, do you feel as if you are being followed? And the questioner also says, I believe that my wife and I had been monitored when we visited Hungary in the 1990s.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case. Today, especially, I mean, it's a lot easier to conduct surveillance on people today than it was back then, which was more of like a human-oriented activity. Actually having somebody tell you, but, you know, with these devices in our pockets, oh boy, you know, the sky's the limit. And as we know in the case of Hungary, they do not shy away from using spyware on one's phone. So when I go back, just because of my profile, you just assume that's the case, which is sad. Like, you shouldn't have to. But, you know, that also is a very costly exercise for whoever's doing it, and you can't surveil everybody. It's something I worry about. I know people who worry about it. I know people who have had, non-Hungarians who had very interesting experiences in Hungary. These are people who were very publicly outspoken about things there. But I mean, that's the kind of regime it is, right? So you just kind of accept it. And
and your life is very different now. Obviously, you have a family, you have young children, and so your situation is much different too. And I'm sure there's a whole nother calculus that you consider. Do you feel like? Do you have any qualms about going back to Hungary, flying there, coming here, back and forth?
I don't. As a journalist, one of the first really ugly smear campaigns I had to deal with happened right when I brought my wife and my newborn son back from the hospital. He was born very prematurely, and they were in the hospital for a few months, and the first day they got home, you turn on the TV and there's like a crazy smear campaign, and you're just like, oh man, they didn't sign up for this. This is, but
smearing
me. Oh yeah, there's all kinds of like nonsense because some story came out about Orban built a soccer stadium next to his house. I did a big story on that, and the timing of that was really bad for the government, and the propaganda ecosystem turned on me. When you have kids, it changes things, but it's also another reason why you continue doing it, because I think as a journalist, yes, you must strive to be unbiased and impartial. You really got to look at stories are complex. The reason I do journalism, or I did journalism, was because I believe in the importance of it. Telling a story, informing people. It's to make it better. It's not, for me, it was never an entertainment thing. It was like, I want to do a story because I want people to know about this. And maybe they'll make better decisions. And you know how important it is when they go after you for it.
Yeah.
And I've had it very easy compared to many people. And it's, just another reason I would encourage all of you to, support local journalism is very important also. But, support it because they're doing hard work.
Yeah.
That matters in a democracy. Doesn't matter in an autocracy. It matters in a democracy.
A good place to leave it. And so I want to I want to close us where we began. Our democracy, like every democracy, requires work, it requires reform, it requires renewed commitment. I want to thank you so much, Ben, for this excellent discussion. It has been truly an honor to really talk about this issue with you and to learn a lot more about Hungary. And as we do with all of the Democracy Series programs, this is an incredibly consequential election, so if you have not already, please do vote. Please encourage others to vote. As Anne Applebaum says, our democracy requires commitment. And I think Ben has very effectively made that case as well. So thank you. Thank you all for attending today's program.